Chapter 3 War and Peace. The following morning, Mark went to visit Leo and his family. Leo's older brother, Timofey, or Timo for short, was there. He was 23 and lived separately from the family, but would often drop by to have a coffee with them in the morning. Leo and Mark told him everything that had happened the day before. Timo was sitting by the kitchen table next to his dad, Sasha, who was about to run off to work. Timo was listening to their story and frowning. When they got to the part where they started running from the police, Timo suddenly stood up, turned around, and walked up to the cupboard. He looked distraught, but tried to maintain composure. Pulling a cup from the shelf, he put it under the coffee machine and hit the start button. The sound of grinding coffee filled the kitchen, drowning out some of the most emotional parts of the boy's story. Timo watched his cup fill to the brim and then turned around, his face red and his eyes full of concern. He sat down at the table and said in a somewhat raspy voice, "Promise me that you will never go there again." The boys stopped telling their story and stared at him in amazement. He looked so dead serious and sounded so genuinely troubled that they didn't dare press him with questions. "I know what I'm talking about," he said finally. "You won't change a thing, but your life will be ruined. Believe me, I know." The boys looked into his eyes and could feel the weightiness of his words. Even though he didn't explain anything, they could feel he spoke from his personal experience of dealing with some darkness. They trusted him and promised never to go to rallies again. Leo kept this promise for about 6 months until Putin announced partial mobilization. While they were talking, Timo's mom, Alyona, entered the kitchen, grabbed a skillet, and started cracking eggs. When she caught a glimpse of Timo's face from the corner of her eye, she was shocked. She had never seen such an expression before. Timo glanced at her and said, "Mom, you must promise me that you will never go to a protest. You and Dad will end up in jail, and I will have to raise Nadia alone." Nadia was his 5-year-old sister adopted from Kyrgyzstan. Timo had heard Alyona mention going to a protest before. He knew that his mom's ability to put up with what was happening in the country was hanging by a thread. Her mood would swing between quiet resignation to a passionate desire to go to a protest and appeal to the government's common sense. She even sewed a tag on her jacket featuring a peace symbol, which made her colleagues at work upset, to say the least. Alyona looked at Timo with compassion and understanding. She came up to him and ruffled his brown hair. "I promise I won't," she said quietly. Timo sighed, even smiled. They had another round of coffee and Timo said, "You can always refuse to go to war and go to jail instead, you know. At least you won't be killing anyone." After some discussion, the boys agreed that it must be the best course of action under the circumstances. Later in the day, Alyona called her good friend Ella and said, "You know, I promised Timo not to go to rallies, but do you know what it means? It means I will have to make a choice between swallowing it up and going nuts. They will come and force our kids to go to the trenches, and we will have to be silent. Many will die there, and we will have to swallow our grief and praise our valiant army. They will come to schools and start inculcating this new doctrine of hatred into our children. They will rewrite history, and our sons will have to learn the right version of history. How long can you take that? I know myself. I will come to a point where being silent is no longer an option. What then? I know I will either end up in an asylum or we will have to leave the country. Yesterday I told Sasha that I was seriously considering going to a one-person picket. He looked at me and said, "I don't want to hold you back, of course. If you feel like going, go. But remember that we have a little daughter, and there have been cases when authorities took adopted children away from those who participated in protests. If you really want to voice your opinion, let's hang a no to war sign on our kitchen window. It's likely that our windows will be broken, but it will spare us worse troubles." "I know what you mean," agreed Ella. "I've been watching Mark. If things continue the way they do, he will start doing something outrageous. I know him. And I won't have the heart to tell him not to do it. He just told me that yesterday he was walking by a truck with a big Z on the windshield and gave the driver a finger. The man cursed him and got out of the truck with a bat in his hand, but happily Mark ran away." "What does Sasha think?" asked Ella. "He can't believe it's actually happening. He's afraid they might close the borders soon." "Yeah, that's what Ilya said too." In fact, Sasha wasn't actually sure what to think. Things were unraveling fast. In a week's time, after February 24th, it became clear that the war wasn't going as planned. Kiev wasn't taken. No one could tell why. By all calculations, the Russian troops should have been marching along Kiev's main street Khreshchatyk by now, but apparently they were pushed back. No one had expected Ukraine to last longer than 3 days, but not only was it lasting, it wasn't going to surrender. Sasha worked as a chief engineer and technology consultant in a microchip company. He had started as an entry-level employee several years prior, but quickly climbed the career ladder. The pay was good. His boss valued him and relied on his advice more and more. Sasha and Alyona had a beautiful apartment near the Lomonosovskaya metro station. Life was good, yet there was something oppressive hanging in the air that made all that good stuff irrelevant. Sasha felt it more and more every day as he sat on his favorite bench in the park where he would eat his lunch. Everything seemed the same ducks and pigeons swarming around him to get a crumb of his yummy bun, the same people hurriedly walking by, the same fountain, the same streets, and yet everything was different. With every line of news he read, he felt that the cage was closing. Sitting on his bench that afternoon, he watched the birds picking his crumbs and thought, "I wish I could turn into a bird and fly away." And somehow the thought became a prayer in his mind as he muttered under his breath, "You told us to look at the birds, and here I am looking at them. They're free, and I'm not. Can you turn me into a bird?" And from the depths of his heart, a voice rose like a silent call. "You can be a bird." The call was deep and beautiful like a mighty tidal wave, filling his soul to the brim with inexplicable longing. It made him feel both at home and far away from home, all at the same time. The feeling reverberated in his soul for a while and slowly melted away, leaving in its wake an acute yearning for something that words could not express. He shook his head and sighed. Yes, he lived in a comfortable cage, and it would probably get even more comfortable for him and his family in the future. He knew he would be promoted soon, but it was still a cage. He felt a strange fear growing in him every day. It was a fear of staying and a fear of leaving at the same time. If we leave, we will lose everything, he thought. But if we stay, we will lose ourselves. He felt these two fears mixing and mingling in his mind, and he was torn between them. Which would prevail, he often wondered. He didn't like the idea of making a decision based on fear. He tried to think it through soberly by weighing all the pros and cons. But no sooner did he weigh some pros and cons than his fear would jump back out of nowhere and grip him midway. He knew that if he continued thinking in a state of fear, he might end up making bad decisions, as he had sometimes done before. Paradoxically enough, even though he was frustrated with himself for not being able to shake off his fear, he didn't allow himself to lose hope, a skill he had learned years ago when life was hard. Years ago, God had taught him to let go every time he would come to a point of despair. He had had many situations where he had come to the end of himself. He remembered that sweet feeling of letting go and letting God in the 90s when he borrowed a sum of money in dollars to buy a car and work as a taxi driver. He toiled day and night, trying to pay off the debt, when the economic crisis hit in 1998. The Russian government devalued the ruble, and the dollar-to-ruble rate skyrocketed to such unfathomable heights that there was no way he could pay off the debt. The next morning, Sasha died to himself. Waking up in the morning, he suddenly realized there was no way he could pay off the debt in time, and it was now up to God. The thought cheered him up so much that he laughed. All his fears were gone. He felt reborn. He sold his car for as much as he could get for it, returned part of the amount, and let go. It turned out just fine. Eventually he found a good job and paid off every cent. Sitting on that bench, Sasha smiled as he remembered those hectic days. His fear was still lingering, but it wasn't controlling him anymore. Not now. He knew it would probably come back, but it would be okay. It's not the end of the world, even if it feels that way. But fear is an odd thing. One moment you are free of it, life is good. You look at the world as a king, untroubled by the ebbs and flows of human existence. But at other moments, something shifts in your brain, and you plummet into an abyss of worry all over again. You try to reason yourself out of worry, but the more you go to your mind to get you out of your mind, the more you go out of your mind. For Sasha, the pendulum between inner war and peace swung for several months in a row, until July 2022, when he took his family for a vacation in Georgia. Georgia is a country in the Caucasus region. Sasha, Alyona, Leo, and Nadia, Tima couldn't go, spent some time in Batumi, and then traveled around the country. They picked Georgia for two reasons. First, it's gorgeous, and second, they wanted to get a feel for the country where they might have to move if things got out of hand in Russia. After a day or two of sleeping in, enjoying the proverbial Georgian hospitality, tasting local wines and bathing in the Black Sea, Sasha made an amazing discovery. His fears were gone. As in, he didn't feel any. He felt like Frodo right after he got rid of the ring. Sam, it's gone. He wondered why he was feeling so good. He even tried to think of something nasty intentionally, but none of his usual troubling thoughts troubled him that much. There was a different atmosphere in Georgia. There was no oppression in the air. Part of it was, of course, the vacation vibes, but when Sasha looked into people's eyes, he didn't notice the same tension as in Russia. By the end of the 2 weeks, he called his friends and said, "I don't want to go back. Going back feels like immersing myself into some poison." And yes, the moment they landed in the Pulkovo airport, fears started creeping back in. The letter Z on every corner, the news of famous actors being declared foreign agents, rumors of the inevitability of mobilization and martial law, all these impressions swept over him. It seemed his fears were trying to make up for the lost time from the previous 2 weeks of not being able to affect him. And finally, they went for the jugular. On September 21st, Putin declared partial mobilization. Everybody knew what it meant. They would recruit as many people as they needed. Partial didn't mean partial. It meant full. They said they'd recruit only 150,000 new soldiers this time, but was there any reason to believe them? They had lied before. It was only the beginning. They would get as many as they wanted. The police were taking people randomly from the streets, and even in the metro, without asking their age or whether they were fit for service. They would conscript men with disabilities, including diabetics, partially blind, and even wheelchair users. Eventually, they started conscripting criminals, murderers, robbers, and drug traffickers. That Friday, Sasha got a call from Ilya. Ilya said they were seriously considering sending Mark away, to Georgia or Turkey. Ilya and Ella had been praying about it and wanted to hear Sasha's opinion. He didn't know what to say. It was hard to think straight. Finally he said, "We need to cool down and rest a little. Let's go to the dacha tomorrow as two families. We will make some shish kebabs, pray, and see what comes up." "Great idea," Ilya answered. So on Saturday, September 24th, they got on the train that took them about 50 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, where their dacha was located.